I'm going to speak on head and neck imaging, but before that I wanted to show you what we have done in Kuwait so far. We have eaten and eaten and eaten. And I think today morning was the best breakfast that I've ever had in my life, and I think my colleagues from Canada agree with me. And this was in the Souk, the Kuwaiti restaurant. We had breakfast. And we thought this was the food that we were going to eat. But then more food came along, and we kept on eating. And then we all were very full, and we thought, okay, that's it for the rest of the day. But there's something in the air in Kuwait which makes you eat and eat, I think, isn't it? And my friend Dr. Shafiq is not over here, but within 1 hour he was eating again. And what was very interesting is he was eating from a very typical Canadian restaurant, Tim Hortons. Dr. Salva Haider knows about that. So these are Timbits from Tim Hortons, which is a Canadian company, and you know how they have Starbucks in USA? In Canada, we drink Tim Hortons all the time. Even I'm addicted to it. Even when I leave the country, I want to have Tim Hortons coffee before I fly out, actually. So anyway, we come back to more serious business, and that is pediatric head and neck imaging. So the objective here is to provide an overview of head and neck lesions in children, to discuss some variations, discuss some head and neck emergencies, and discuss other common head and neck abnormalities. So it's a general sort of talk on head and neck lesions. As an overview, remember that most head and neck lesions in childhood are either congenital or infective or inflammatory. And our imaging goal is to characterize them, try to get to a diagnosis, and to see the extent of involvement of the head and neck. And we can use all three techniques, and sometimes these are complementary. So when we use imaging techniques, you worry about safety, particularly from a radiation point of view. So we know that there's been a significant increase in the use of CT in the last decade or two in North America particularly, and it's a significant cause of the medically given radiation doses. So almost 50 to 60% of the radiation dose given in medicine is from CT scan. So we try to make judicious use of CT scan to adjust parameters so that you give the least radiation dose possible. The other thing that when you do any imaging, is to think of sedation. And obviously, MRI needs sedation, CT does not, because it is very, very fast. In general, we use ultrasound and CT as the primary modalities for head and neck lesions, and MR as a complementary imaging technique. There are certain patterns of variations that we should recognize in children, and this is from a chapter that we wrote in the neuroimaging clinics of North America, where you can see that the mineralization of the anterior skull base in infants and toddlers is not completed. So don't mistake this for deficits or gaps. This is just unossified bone. And ossification begins in the roof of the ethmoid from the lateral to the medial aspect. And then over time, by about 3 years or so, you'll see complete ossification of the central portion of the anterior cranial fossa. There are certain other things that we see in children all the time. One of the big things is enlarged lymph nodes. You see it all the time when you image in the pediatric age group up to 10, 12, 14 years of age. So these are normal lymph nodes. We don't even worry about them. For example, the lateral retropharyngeal node of Rouvier, which if you were to see in an adult, you start suspecting squamous cell carcinoma of the nasopharyngeal mucosa. We see that very routinely in young children, and that is not abnormal. But mind you, when you see very large lymph nodes like this, lymphoma and leukemia can also do that. But more often than not, when you see lymph nodes in the neck, they are reactive lymph nodes, not of any significance. This is a case that I already showed you. Remember that the tissues in the prevertebral space or the retropharyngeal space are very lax, and often they can just, because the child is crying or expiring against resistance, and these can blow out. So this was a case that I showed you in my cervical spine talk, where the prevertebral soft tissues are normal. This was a CT scan done within 20 minutes of this X-ray. So we'll come to infections. This was a child with an upper respiratory tract infection and had a sudden deterioration in his status, where he found it more difficult to breathe. And usually we do not image infections unless there is a complication. We would sometimes image to look at the size of the abscess to see whether it needs drainage. So in our institution, if you have a 2.5 centimeter sized area of low attenuation with rim enhancement, then that is considered something that they would drain. The surgeons would drain that, otherwise it would be treated with antibiotics. If you suspect vascular complication or extension into the mediastinum, then you would image. In this particular child, if you look at the CT scan carefully in the axial view, there is this rounded extra enhancement of vessel which should not be there. And there is this swelling which had acutely increased, causing respiratory distress. So if you look carefully at the MIPT image, there was a pseudoaneurysm from this infection eroding one of the vessels deep in the neck. So be careful about this. This was the lateral X-ray of the same child. So this was a large retropharyngeal abscess with a secondary complication of pseudoaneurysm. This was a child, a 6-year-old boy. One of our senior fellows, a very bright British radiologist, was working with us. He was on call with me. So this child came in at 5:30 in the morning. I don't know why they were playing at 5:30 a.m. in the morning with each other, but these siblings were playing with each other, and one of the pencils, they caused a little small puncture in the neck, and then there was a small swelling over there. So they got the child to the ER at 5 in the morning. By 5:30, the child was cooperative, so we did a CT scan. The fellow who was very reliable actually reported this as, just a hematoma in this area. I happened to come in very early that day at 7 a.m. to read the overnight cases, and I looked at it, and I said, yeah, I agree with you, it is normal. Then I went back to look at it again before signing off, and then I said, oh my God. Can anybody pick up the abnormality over here? Correct, somebody picked it up. And if you look very carefully, this is the ICA, and there's a little irregularity over here. And we couldn't really see it very well unless we reformatted it. So use all the tools that you have at your disposal. And if you look at the reformats, you can see that that was a pseudoaneurysm. So very often in children, the trauma can look trivial or minimal, but the underlying injury can be very serious. So this was actually vessel wall damage with a pseudoaneurysm, which had caused the huge hematoma. Look at the swelling over there. And of course, as soon as we reported that, we called up the ENT surgeons, they called up the vascular surgeons from across the street from Mount Sinai. They came in and repaired this vessel. By 10 a.m. that vessel was repaired, otherwise it would have suddenly bled sometime during the next day or two, and it would have been catastrophic for the child. These things are something that you guys are very familiar with, but I thought I would show you because these are critical things that come along, and you can diagnose it on X-rays. You don't need CT, MR. This is epiglottitis, where you can see the thumb-like swollen epiglottis in the nasopharynx just at or above the level of the hyoid. So very classic, typical finding of epiglottitis. This is croup, where the obstruction is subglottic and lower than the epiglottis. So the epiglottis looks normal over here. And there is a classic sign described over here. This is the normal appearance of the airway. This is the glottis, and then you see this little thin airway. Here the airway, because of the glottic edema, is narrowed like this, and this is the steeple sign, the steeple of the church. So I was talking about food, right? What is the diagnosis over here? Anybody can shout out the diagnosis? Both, yes. So this came to us from an outside hospital, from a community hospital, reported by an emergency room physician. The radiologist had not yet looked at it, and this was called normal. But the child had respiratory problems, difficulty in breathing, so they sent them to sick kids. And you can see this fishbone. And in addition to the fishbone, because the history was like from 2 to 3 days, there's a small amount of air in the retropharyngeal soft tissue. And this was a retropharyngeal abscess with a fishbone. So look out for those findings. The fishbone can often be very subtle and you may not see it very well, so think of those things. We come to congenital things, and that is epithelial inclusion cysts. So when you have dermoids, epidermoids, and teratomas, these are all epithelial inclusion cysts. Sometimes when I cannot make out the differentiation, I just use the general term as epithelial inclusion cysts. So we'll talk about nasal dermoids to begin with. This is normal, where you have the dura doesn't connect with the tip of the nose or with the scalp. Now during early development, what happens is there's a dural stalk which projects through the prenasal space up to the skin in the nose over here. And then with time that regresses completely, and it doesn't have any communication with the outside environment, with the skin or the subcutaneous tissues. But if any of that tract is left behind, it can develop into an epidermoid or a dermoid. And this is what causes an epithelial inclusion cyst along this tract. So this is basically sequestration of epithelial rest during embryogenesis. Now 10% of all pediatric head and neck masses are epithelial inclusion cysts. We call them epidermoids when they only have ectoderm, dermoids when they have ecto and mesoderm, and teratoma when they have all three layers. So quickly show you a simple dermoid, which I'm pretty sure many of you have seen in your clinical practice. A small sort of soft swelling along the lateral eyebrow, and you can see the fatty density, and this is a very, very classic dermoid of the orbit. Usually doesn't cause a problem, grows very slowly if at all. Then we have the classic nasal dermoid, and you can see that little rounded low density. This one is important because we try to see whether it's connected to the brain or not, because if there's a communication intracranially, then it causes infection, and then you need to worry about it. So you can see this particular dermoid is going up through the nasal septum into the crista galli. And if you look at it on the bone window images, this crista galli, or the foramen cecum in the crista galli, is widened, and it is bifid, and there's a definite communication of that nasal dermoid intracranially. And if you see this on MR, not the same patient but a different patient, this is the dermoid, and you can see it went through that nasal septum into the intracranial cavity. In fact, there's a little bit of dermoid or fatty tissue even within the falx cerebri anteriorly. So once you have it intracranial like that, then they need to resect it because it can be a source of infection, or the epidermoid or dermoid can rupture and cause a chemical meningitis. Then we have more severe forms of epithelial inclusion cysts, and these are the nasopharyngeal teratomas, or hairy polyps as they are called. You can see the multiple cystic areas, probably some calcification over here, and this is going from a dermoid to an epidermoid. It probably has all three layers, so it's a teratoma. Then you have this classic dermoid of the floor of the mouth. Now this is a very, very rare sort of picture, which I'm sure is the same picture that we all use in North America. This is called a sack of marble appearance. I've seen it once, and I've never seen it again in the last 14 years. So all of us show the same picture. These are just locules of fat, and it looks like a sack of marbles. It's a very classic appearance of a oral cavity dermoid. Now on CT, when you have a low attenuation lesion in the floor of the mouth, it's difficult to say which is epidermoid and which is dermoid. Often MR is the one which gives you the diagnosis. But let's try in this case. Which is epidermoid and which is dermoid? Anybody? Obviously, I think the low attenuation one would be more fat, whereas that would be more epidermoid. So that is epidermoid and that is dermoid, but if you do an MR, you'll make out this is an epidermoid at the floor of the mouth. I'm showing you these coronal T1 and T2 images for a reason, and that is to look at the mylohyoid muscle. Before we come to that, just wanted to quickly say the difference between dermoid and epidermoid is that the dermoid contains elements of hair, the skin appendages, whereas epidermoid doesn't contain the skin appendages. So the mylohyoid muscle, you need to look at the relationship of the mylohyoid muscle to lesions in the floor of the mouth. If it is above, then you obviously need to operate on it through the mouth. If it is below, then you can approach externally to excise it completely. Just a little surgical important anatomy over there. Now when you have newborns with a large neck mass like this clinically, there are only two diagnoses that we think of. One is a large lymphatic malformation in trisomy 21 or the Turner syndrome, or a large nasopharyngeal teratoma. This particular one was a big teratoma. You can see the complex mass with cysts. And in another case, in a CT scan, these will often have calcification. Sometimes they have teeth and they have big fatty components. So this was teratoma. We then come to the second, the next variety of congenital lesions, and these are the cephaloceles. And you can classify them by location or content. If they contain only meninges, meningocele, if they have meninges and brain, meningoencephalocele, etc. Now, amongst the Caucasian population, the occipital encephaloceles are more common than the frontal ones. But overall, the frontoethmoidal are much more common because the Asian population or the Oriental population is much, much bigger than the Caucasian population. And their presentation depends on location. For example, if you have the rare basal encephalocele, then they present with nasal obstruction and stuffiness. Mind you that all these cephaloceles, the meningoceles, encephaloceles, they have intracranial abnormalities and you should look for them. So we talk about the frontoethmoidal cephaloceles, and it depends on where they come out from. They come out to the dural stalk that I showed you, and those are like the nasofrontal or nasoethmoidal encephaloceles. They can come out to the roof of the orbit. And there is a foramen over here called the fonticulus frontalis. So if that is persistent, then they can come out directly anteriorly into the frontal region. So this is one classic case of a frontoethmoidal meningoencephalocele. You can see the hypertelorism, you can see this herniation of the brain and CSF contents. And you can see that when brain herniates into these contents, is often of abnormal signal. It is encephalomalacic. So they usually excise this, they don't push it back because this brain is dead tissue already. So see the hypertelorism. See the sagittal view. On the sagittal view is very important when you look at them to see if the anterior cerebral artery is herniating into this meningoencephalocele or not. It looks like it is far away, but many times this vessel will be tortuous. It will go in over here and come back. And you want to tell that to the surgeon so they don't snip it off and cause a major hemorrhagic complication. These are the CT images of the same patient, just to show you how we use MR and CT scan in a complementary way. The bone defect, and then you do a 3D CT because they need this to plan for the bone graft to close this hole off, when they repair this with plastic surgery. And this is just the soft tissue construction from the CT images to show you what the child looked like. This is the very rare basal transsphenoidal encephalocele, and you can see that the optic nerve is herniating into this, and the optic apparatus is going down into this encephalocele, and this is through the persistent craniopharyngeal duct. If you know that the pituitary gland actually forms in the roof of the nasopharynx and then migrates up into the sella through this craniopharyngeal duct, and when you have a persistent large craniopharyngeal duct, then you can get a basal meningocele or a meningoencephalocele or just an encephalocele. Notice more abnormalities. I told you always look for intracranial abnormalities. So look at the corpus callosum. It is missing. And then this is the classic appearance of colpocephaly due to corpus callosal agenesis. And this was the bony cellar defect, which again we use 3D CT to show to the neurosurgeons and the plastic surgeons how to reformat or make a bone graft. And of course also has hypertelorism. Now this is even more rare, where actually there's ectopic brain tissue being formed along the persistent craniopharyngeal canal, and this is a ectopic hamartoma or a glioma as they call in the base of the skull. It's not really a tumor, it is just ectopic hamartomatous tissue. Then we come to the more simple cystoceles, the dacryocystoceles. This is just dilatation of the nasolacrimal duct secondary to proximal and distal duct obstruction due to imperforate Hasner's membrane. And I wanted to ask you this question, but I'll show it to you anyway. People forget about the most common cause of nasal obstruction in a neonate, and that is the first is mucosal edema, then choanal atresia, and then dacryocystoceles. So just to show you a classic dacryocystoceles, bilateral and enlarged nasolacrimal ducts. And these are often very easy to treat. You just massage the distal end of the nasolacrimal duct, the Hasner's membrane perforates, and they get relieved. Sometimes if they persist, this is just an MR appearance of bilateral dacryocystoceles. You can see the fluid intensity on MR. These are T2 weighted images. Sometimes if they persist, they can get infected, and then you get a thick enhancing wall, and then you get a fluid level, and it can cause dacryocystitis. So we come to the next big group of anomalies of the head and neck. These are lesions which we commonly see in children, and these are vascular anomalies. Now this classification of Mulliken and Glowacki is very, very commonly used, and I like it because it fits in with radiology that we see very well. You have infantile hemangiomas, which are true tumors. Then you have the true vascular malformations. Amongst the infantile hemangiomas, you have the high flow proliferating hemangioma, which occurs within a few months or a few weeks after birth, then grows rapidly to 3 to 4 years and starts involuting. So the proliferating hemangioma becomes involuting by 3-4 years of life. Then you have the true vascular malformations. The high flow ones like AVMs and AVFs are extremely rare. The slow flow ones like lymphatic, venous, and the mixed malformations are much more common, and I'll show you examples of those. There are various associations intracranially, and we'll talk about some of them as we go through some case examples. Now this is an updated classification of the International Society for Study of Vascular Anomalies, and basically what it has done is included all the rare lesions that sometimes are visible only clinically and not in radiology. So this is the complete classification. As radiologists, though some classification will suit us better, we should know what the clinicians are talking about so that we can talk their language. So let's talk about infantile hemangioma, which is a very common lesion that we see in this age group. So it presents within 1 to 3 months of life. Presentation at birth is uncommon, has a proliferation phase which is very short, and then starts involuting, and most of them will disappear by about 3, 4, 5 years of life. In the Caucasian population, it's very easy to detect this because there's a reddish or a strawberry discoloration of the overlying skin. In the Asian or the African population, it's difficult to detect that because of the dark skin. Now, mind you, initially, Kasabek-Merritt syndrome, which is consumption of platelets, was described with hemangioma, but that was a wrong article. That was actually a hemangioendothelioma. Hemangiomas per se are very benign lesions and never cause platelet consumption. So this is one classic hemangioma. You can see on T1 a mass which is iso-intense and has multiple flow voids, slightly hyperintense. You can see it is less hyperintense than CSF and causes vivid enhancement with contrast. This is T1 FATSAT coronal images. And over time, this is a 2-year follow-up in the same case, not treated with anything. You can see there's fatty replacement of the hemangioma, and it will completely disappear in the next year or two. So you don't often have to treat them unless they compromise the airway or a critical structure like the orbit. Another classic example in the left low neck, that's T1. This is T1 FATSAT with contrast, and you can see the flow voids within it. This is the T2 weighted image. So those were two classic hemangiomas. Now, whenever we look at classic lesions, we always have to think of everything else, the age of presentation and everything else that goes with it to make a diagnosis. So let me ask you about this lesion. This is in the orbit, flow voids, and you can see this is the ultrasound color Doppler. Hemangiomas are very vascular lesions. I didn't show you the color Doppler on the previous cases. Now this is diffusion restriction. So what do you think the diagnosis is? Somebody said hemangioma? So when this came to us first, the staff that was reporting it actually called it hemangioma. But then when you think more, 7-year-old, a very short history. And the other thing which I didn't tell you is diffusion restriction doesn't occur in hemangiomas. So because of the wrong age group and the wrong sort of presentation, we thought more, and actually we did offer a diagnosis. So now what do you think this is? So in the head and neck area, when you think of a malignant lesion, you think often of a rhabdomyosarcoma. So that was a rhabdomyosarcoma. So even though sometimes lesions look like the normal lesions, think of the age, the presentation, and then come to the correct diagnosis. This was a rhabdomyosarcoma. We come to the next group of important lesions that occur in the head and neck, and that is lymphatic malformations. This occurs due to obstruction of the developing lymphatic system. Our lymphatic system is most mature by age of 2 years, so most of these lesions become more obvious in 2 years and beyond. And there are a lot of associations with Turner syndrome and trisomy 21. So this is the large neck mass. I showed you a teratoma. The other differential for this is a lymphatic malformation. These lymphatic malformations do not enhance, but they have vessels in the septa and the wall, and they can have internal hemorrhages, and you can see these fluid levels, which has caused this lesion to expand suddenly. This is the more classic one, which is seen. This is a 7 or 8-year-old child with CT scan. This is very, very classic, non-enhancing, septated, transspatial cystic mass. If a resident goes to exam and describes it in these 3 or 4 words, you immediately know that they know everything about this lymphatic malformation. And the MR appearance is very similar. It's a fluid-filled mass with some septations, hardly sees any enhancement. This is T1 with FATSAT. So very straightforward diagnosis. Now we come to the venous or the mixed malformations. Often the venous malformations are not pure by themselves, they are mixed with lymphatic. So we call them mixed veno-lymphatic malformations. They start presenting at a little later on in life, around 10 to 12 years, and they grow with the age of the child. They don't involute like the hemangiomas, and they have a bluish discoloration of the overlying skin, unlike the very reddish or the strawberry discoloration of the hemangioma. So this is one classic example. You can see that it is fluid filled, almost like CSF or even brighter. It is T1 hypointense. And then it shows peripheral solid enhancement. The enhancing portion is a venous malformation. The non-enhancing portion is supposed to be the lymphatic malformation. So these are often mixed. And remember that when they occur around the face or the head region, they often are associated with intracranial anomalies, and this is a developmental venous anomaly. The classic medulla head appearance, draining into a large vein which will drain deep into the venous system. Now mind you, amongst those malformations that I showed you, it is only the venous malformations which have phlebolysis. So this is very interesting because some people get confused. If amongst you those who do musculoskeletal radiology, you'll remember that intramuscular hemangiomas also contain phlebolysis, right? So you will think this guy is telling me that only venous malformations have phlebolysis. The reason is that what is called as an intramuscular hemangioma is actually a venous malformation. So it's just called different by different subspecialty groups. And that is something we should use common terminology. We often get confused when we don't. Then we come to thyroglossal duct cyst, and this is amongst one of the most common abnormalities that occurs in the head and neck in children. And this happens in and around the hyoid bone, and this is a classic appearance of that simple cyst which is in close relation to the hyoid bone, moves with swallowing. It is inseparable from the overlying strap muscles. And this is a classic appearance, that hourglass constriction as it goes to the foramen cecum. So there's a foramen cecum at the crista galli in the anterocranial fossa, and there's a foramen cecum at the floor of the mouth posteriorly, through which the thyroglossal duct goes, and this is where this cyst causes a constriction with this classic appearance. And when it gets infected, you will see the classic rim enhancement and surrounding edema, etc. Then we come to the very unusual thing that happens, is the ectopic thyroid tissue. Now this is very common at autopsy, but symptomatic lesions are very rare. And sometimes they enlarge with physiological stress of puberty or pregnancy, and they often present at a very older age compared to what we see. So we don't see this very commonly in children, but we see it in the older age group. Now, some of them are hypothyroid and some of them are symptomatic. Now, treatment involves thyroxine suppression, surgical removal, or even radioactive iodine ablation. And they occur along the same tract of the thyroglossal duct. Most commonly, they occur at the floor of the mouth, at the base of the tongue, but they can occur anywhere. Then we come to branchial anomalies. I think I had a slide, but I missed it for the ectopic thyroid thing. Amongst the branchial anomalies, you have cysts and fistula. Cysts are more easy to diagnose on radiology, and I'll show you an example. The second branchial anomaly is the most common of them all, and the second branchial anomalous cyst is very common, and this Bailey's type 2 cyst of the second branchial anomaly is what occurs 90% of the time. So if you know about this, you know most of the branchial anomalies. This happens right anterior to the sternocleidomastoid and posterior to the angle of the mandible, very classic location. Now mind you, I wanted to just make sure that everybody remembers this. This is the MR appearance of the same branchial anomalous cyst. And this is the CT appearance of an infected branchial cleft cyst. Now remember that when you have an older patient or an adult, 40, 50 years old, and you see something like this, necrotic lymph nodes can look exactly similar, metastatic necrotic lymph nodes. So in a young child, it's okay, it's a second branchial cleft cyst, but in an older patient, make sure you have that differential diagnosis in mind. Many people make the mistake of complicated branchial cleft cyst and then mistake a necrotic lymph node, which may be the first manifestation of a malignancy in the nasopharynx. We come to a rare branchial anomaly, and this is rare but a very, very classic presentation, which if you see it once, you'll always diagnose it. So this is a child, you can see this is the thyroid gland, and this is involvement of the thyroid gland by this inflammatory phlegmon. And if you can see, this is a coronal T1 fat site. There seems to be some sort of fistula or tract running. We didn't know where it was going. This is the pyriform sinus on the right side. So in such a case where you have involvement of the thyroid gland on the left side with some inflammatory mass, what would you do next to make a diagnosis? Anybody? Correct. So you do a pharyngoscopy straight away and you'll see this punctum, and that is classic for a third or fourth branchial cleft fistula cyst, often involves the thyroid gland. What I showed you was a common presentation, and this is an uncommon presentation where you see a small bubble of air in the superior pole of the left thyroid. But this is when this third branchial / fourth branchial fistula is not yet infected. And this is a very, very sort of pathognomic appearance of this disease process. It's very rare though. We published a series of, I think, 18 cases in AJNR recently. Then we have this very common thing that occurs in infancy where you get focal fibrosis of the sternocleidomastoid and focal thickening. And you need to do ultrasound in this, and it's very classic. You'll see fusiform spindle-shaped swelling of the sternocleidomastoid. Now remember, if you get confused and you do an MR or CT, you will think this is sarcoma because it shows abnormal enhancement, a lot of edema, and you'll really get confused. But the clinical history is very classic. Ultrasound appearance is very classic, and you don't really need to do an MR. If you really do an MR, it'll cause confusion. So we also need to discuss a little bit about the complex craniofacial abnormalities, and I think I have another 5 to 10 minutes. So this is Crouzon syndrome, a classic appearance. Remember that when you have complex craniofacial syndromes, you have craniosynostosis. Often these children will have elevated intracranial pressure, they'll have ocular dislocation, they will have problems with sleep apnea. You can do a lot for these kids nowadays. Before we could not. For example, see this child before surgery and after surgery, almost looks normal now. This is with permission of the parents. What they do is they have these prostheses which they use to distract the skull bone, advance the orbits, and they can make them look extremely nice and normal for the long term. So surgery, craniofacial surgery has advanced a lot for these children, and we play a very important role in the management of these patients. Now when you do manage craniofacial malformation, they say it takes a cost of 1,000. So in our hospital we have a multidisciplinary team which works together. We do CTs very often, and what we do is we optimize our technique because these children will need repeat CT scans over the next 10, 12, 15 years of their life. And what we do is initially we just do 3D CT scans which gives only 0.29 millisieverts. If you do a regular brain CT, that's 2 millisieverts. So we really reduce the dose using techniques which are optimized for these sort of cases where multiple CT scans are required. And what is very interesting is we use all these expensive prostheses, and our ENT surgeon or the craniofacial surgeon, Christopher Forrest, he's one of the best surgeons that I have known. He takes these prostheses, when the job is done, he takes them out, they autoclave them, sterilize them, and he sends them to a hospital in India, southern India, in Chennai. And this is a great photograph from there. These are patients waiting for their prostheses to be removed, and you can see how normal they look because of this free donation of these expensive prostheses which cost thousands of dollars otherwise. So it's a good job that's going on at SickKids, and I'm happy to see that it helps some of the developed countries and some of the population in those countries. I want to finish off with hypertelorism, and this is a confusion that I was often dealing with as to how exactly do I define hypertelorism. So this is the definition by Tessier. As you know, Tessier is one of the godfathers of craniofacial surgery. So if it is more than 30-34 degrees, 30-34 millimeters, then That is hypertelorism. What we usually use is that if you can fit in one eye globe between the two eye globes, that's normal. If it is more, it is hyper. If it is less, it is hypo. I always used to get confused because the measurements never really stood the test of what I saw clinically. So there can be a lot of variation, and it is often in the eye of the beholder of what you perceive. For example, if you look at Brad Pitt, he's a very handsome looking guy, most women would agree, but he's really hypotelluric, he's got hypotelorism. And then you look at his wife, Angelina Jolie. Most men particularly find her to be beautiful, but she's hypertelluric actually. So it's in the eye of the beholder. I just thought I would put it out there. Thank you so much for your attention.